Good evening, everybody. My name is David Dixon. I'm Dean of UNSW Law School. Welcome to the 2011 Hal Wootten Lecture. This, our major annual public lecture, is of course in honour of our Foundation Dean, and Hal will be speaking later tonight, giving the vote of thanks. First, I'd like to call on my colleague, Professor Martin Krieger, to introduce the 2011 Hal Wootten speaker, Professor Martha Nussbaum. Martin, thank you.
Thank you, David. As all of you who have read the invitation will know, Professor Nussbaum is Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago, and there she graces the Department of Philosophy, the School of Law, School of Divinity. She has associate appointments in classics and in political science. Her array of writings and accomplishments is bewilderingly vast and varied, and I recommend them to everyone, though you'll need to have a lot of time. You'll perhaps emerge exhausted, but also much wiser than when you began. That's a general truth. So there are no exceptions to it, I think. And I won't seek to survey these works tonight, but merely confine myself to a few general observations. Professor Nussbaum is a thinker of quite extraordinary intellectual range, erudition, insight, and seriousness of concern. I say thinker for a reason, though I could have equally said philosopher, since that's her primary training, lawyer, since she's professor in a great law school and has made significant contributions to legal scholarship, theorist of human capabilities and development, since she's contributed so much to those fields, feminist, classicist, or many other things. She's distinguished in all of those fields and more. But I chose thinker since, while the modern university has many distinguished exponents of particular disciplines, it has few people not trapped within, but on the contrary, capable of transcending a variety of disciplines, while still having things to say that command respect within and beyond them all. Like another great thinker and polymath, Max Weber, Nussbaum can say proudly and with authority, "I'm not a donkey and I don't have a field." Thinkers of such range, lucidity, capacity, and depth are rare at the best of times, and we don't live in the best of times. For three trends in the modern university and the modern world increasingly militate against the existence of the species of which Professor Nussbaum is such a remarkable representative. Indeed, they endanger it. One of these is hyper and increasingly narrow specialisation. Another is a particularly crimped and pinched understanding of what might be involved in professional education. And the third is the rampant colonisation by commercial frames of thought and understanding of fields of life which obey different rhythms than those of commerce and tend to wither at its touch. There's a lot to be said about each of these trends, and not all of it is bad, though quite a lot of it is bad. It's enough here to observe that together they make a highly toxic cocktail, particularly poisonous to anyone with a generous humanistic vision, such as Professor Nussbaum's, of the worth and conditions of the life of the mind. Among the things most threatened is cultivation of humanistic pursuits, talents, and sympathies, not merely in the wider society, but in the universities where they've so long been nurtured, and which now often seem decreasingly able to recognise any good reason for them, except perhaps that they don't cost much, but then they don't make much either. What, the implicit question is so often, are the humanities useful for? What, for example, can they contribute to the bottom line, to the training of professionals, training, not education, to their skill set, to their job prospects? One answer to that question can be found in the marvellous writings of Pierre Ryckmans, under his pseudonym very often of Simon Leys, many of them collected in his most recent book, The Hall of Uselessness. This eloquent and powerful praise and exemplification of the usefulness of useless things is made plausible, indeed irrefutable, in his case, by his own luminous, erudite, and profoundly, notwithstanding his disclaimers, profoundly useful example. Another answer is Professor Nussbaum's. The humanities are among the most useful things any student, any professional, indeed any citizen, can come to know. Among their uses are the broadening of sympathies, empathy and imagination, resistance to parochialism of place, time and disciplinary training, and a heightened capacity to do what she does so well, so humanely and over such a broad range, to think critically for oneself about things that matter. Hal Wootten first introduced me to Edmund Burke's observation that the study of law tends to sharpen the mind by narrowing it. And we can all observe that that's often the case. But it was certainly not his case. And as his life of good work has shown, there are other ways to be a lawyer and other ways to study law. No one's better equipped than Professor Nussbaum to expose many of those ways and their virtues to us. And so it's with great expectation and enthusiasm that I invite Professor Nussbaum to deliver this year's Hal Wootten lecture, Not for Profit, Why Legal Education Needs the Humanities. Professor Nussbaum.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Krieger, for that very helpful introduction, which really said eloquently in 5 minutes what I'm going to take a much longer time to say. But thank you also, Dean Dixon, for the invitation. And just, it's so lovely to be here and to celebrate the anniversary of this great law school and to have Hal Wootten here in the front row, whose writings I've gotten to know by now and whom I admire so much. So I'm going to begin this lecture with a quotation from one of my great idols, the Indian educator and philosopher and so many other things, artist in so many genres, Rabindranath Tagore, who founded a school that was called All the World University, which really did the things that I'm going to be talking about. But he saw that that was not in fashion in the world around him. And so in 1917, he wrote, "History has come to a stage when the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way, almost without knowing it, to make room for the commercial man, the man of limited purpose. This process, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization." We're in the midst of a crisis of global proportions and grave consequences. And I don't mean the global economic crisis that began in 2008. At least then, everyone knew that a crisis was at hand, and leaders worked quickly and desperately to find solutions, and they're still at it. No, I mean a crisis that's gone largely unnoticed, and a crisis that's likely to be, in the long run, at least as damaging, and perhaps more damaging, to the future of democratic self-government, a worldwide crisis in education. This crisis affects education at all levels, but it definitely affects legal education. Studying the general issue, but focusing particularly on legal education, I will argue that the broad humanistic vision of legal education promoted by Hal Wootten is needed more than ever in a time of increasing globalization. It's under threat, however, from retrenchment in the humanities at all levels and in virtually all countries. Radical changes are occurring everywhere in what democratic societies teach young people, and these changes have not been well thought through. Eager for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are necessary to keep democracy alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing generations of useful, docile machines rather than complete citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition and authority, and understand the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements. And of course, I'm talking about the humanities and arts, which are being cut away in both primary and secondary education and in university education in virtually every nation of the world, seen by policymakers as useless frills at a time when nations must cut away all useless things in order to stay competitive in the global market. They're rapidly losing their place in curricula and in the minds and hearts of parents and young people. Consider these three examples. They're, in fact, not drawn from legal education, but then I'm going to go on to show what's happening in legal education. So first, in the fall of the year 2006, U.S. Department of Education's Commission on the Future of Higher Education, headed by Bush administration's Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, released a report on the state of higher education called A Test of Leadership, Charting the Future of U.S. Higher Education. Now, this report did contain a valuable critique of unequal access to higher education, but when it came to subject matter, it focused entirely on education for national economic gain. It concerned itself with perceived deficiencies in science, technology, and engineering, and not even basic scientific research, but only highly applied learning that can quickly generate profit-making strategies. The humanities, the arts, and critical thinking were just not there. And by omitting them, the report strongly suggested that it would be perfectly all right if those abilities were allowed to wither away in favor of more useful disciplines. Second, in the fall of the year 2009 in Britain, the Labour government issued new guidelines for its research excellence framework, which assesses all individuals and departments in British universities. According to the new criteria, fully 25% of every individual researcher's grade will be based on that person's impact, which means basically contribution to national economic growth and success. The humanities and the arts are now forced to become pitchmen for a product, and they're able to justify their contribution and their claim to funding only if they can demonstrate a direct short-term economic impact. And since that time, several philosophy departments have been completely closed, and of course then, when the conservative government came to power, all funding for the humanities was simply cut. Last example, again from the US, this fall the State University of New York at Albany made drastic cuts in the humanities, completely closing classics, theater, and several modern languages, and severely cutting others. This followed similar cuts at the University of Nevada and several other state universities. Well, not to belabor the obvious, there are hundreds of stories like these, and new ones come in every day, in the US, in Europe, in India, and certainly in Australia. Given that economic growth is so eagerly sought by all nations, too few questions are being posed in both developed and developing nations about the direction of education and with it of democratic society. With the rush to profitability in the global market, non-technical abilities are at risk of getting lost, abilities crucial to the health of any democracy internally and to the creation of a decent world culture and a robust type of global citizenship capable of constructively addressing the world's most pressing problems. These abilities are associated with the humanities and the arts. The ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties and to approach world problems as what I would call a citizen of the whole world, and the ability to imagine sympathetically the predicament of another person. Now, why should one think that these issues are pertinent to legal education? Lawyers are not only citizens, often, in fact, leading citizens, they're also, in their professional capacity, servants of all a democracy's citizens. Placed in a position of trust and great strategic importance, they must be able to understand and articulate the concerns of all parts of a diverse society. They also have a special role in securing social justice for previously marginalized and victimized groups. It was part of Hal Wooden's founding vision that the lawyer must not be a privileged acolyte of the wealthy classes, but a servant of all, and his vision was shaped in particular by Australia's long struggle to overcome a legacy of injustice to Indigenous Aboriginal people. So we need to think about how legal education can sustain and improve its capacity to produce citizens of this wide-ranging and capaciously imaginative sort, citizens who, in Wooden's words, live greatly in the law. To think about education for democratic citizenship, though, we have to start by thinking about what democratic nations are and what they're striving for. So what does it mean, then, for a nation to advance? On one view, which I've been struggling against for most of my career, it means to increase its gross national product per capita. This measure of national success has for decades been the standard one used by development economists around the world as if it were a good proxy for a nation's overall quality of life. The goal of a nation, says this model of development, should be economic growth. Never mind about distribution and social equality, never mind about the preconditions of stable democracy, never mind about the quality of race and gender relations, never mind about the improvement of other aspects of a human being's quality of life, such as health and education. One sign of what that old model left out is the fact that South Africa under apartheid used to shoot to the top of the development indices. Well, there was a lot of wealth around somewhere in the old South Africa, and the old model of development rewarded that achievement, or good fortune, ignoring the staggering distributional inequalities, the brutal apartheid regime, and the health and educational deficiencies and inequalities that went with it. We might also think about Australia, where a high average GDP coexisted over many generations with the exclusion and oppression of the Aboriginal peoples. This model of development has by now been rejected by many serious development thinkers, but it continues to dominate a lot of policy making. Many nations and states within nations are pursuing this model. Proponents of the old model sometimes claim that the pursuit of economic growth will, by itself, deliver all the other good things I've mentioned, health, education, a decrease in social and economic inequality. By now, however, examining the results of divergent social experiments, we see clearly that the old model really does not deliver those goods as claimed. Achievements in health and education, for example, are very poorly correlated with economic growth, nor does political liberty track growth, as we can see from the stunning success of China. So producing economic growth does not mean producing democracy, nor does it mean producing a healthy, engaged, educated population in which opportunities for a good and rewarding human life are available to all social classes. Still, everyone likes economic growth these days, and the trend is, if anything, toward increasing reliance on what I like to call the old paradigm, rather than toward a more complex account of what society should be trying to achieve for their people. What sort of education does the old model of development suggest? Education for economic enrichment needs basic skills, literacy and numeracy. It also needs some people to have more advanced skills in computer science, engineering, and technology, although equal access is not terribly important. A nation's economy can grow very nicely, while the rural poor remain illiterate and without basic computer resources, as recent events in certain Indian states show. In states like Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, we've seen the creation of increased GDP per capita through the education of a technical elite who make the state attractive to foreign investment. The results of this enrichment do not trickle down to improve the health and well-being of the rural poor, and there's no reason to think that economic growth requires educating them adequately. That was always the first and most basic problem with the GDP per capita paradigm of development. It neglects distribution and can give high marks to nations or states that contain inequalities. This is very true of education. Given the nature of our current information economy, nations can increase their GDP without worrying very much about the distribution of education, so long as they create a competent tech and business elite. After that, education for economic growth needs perhaps a rudimentary familiarity with history and economic fact, on the part of the people who are going to get past elementary education in the first place, who are likely to be a small elite. But care must be taken lest the historical and economic narrative lead to any serious critical thinking about class, about whether foreign investment is really good for the rural poor, about whether democracy can survive when such huge inequalities in basic life chances obtain. So critical thinking would not be a very important part of education for economic growth, and it has not been in states that have pursued that goal relentlessly, such as the Western Indian state of Gujarat, well known for its combination of growth-oriented policies with docility and groupthink in the government schools. I've spoken about critical thinking and history, but what about the arts, so often valued by democratic educators? An education for short-term profit will, first of all, have contempt for these parts of a child's training because they don't lead to increased GDP. For this reason, all over the world, programs in arts and humanities at all levels are being cut away. But educators for profit-making will probably do more than ignore the arts. They will fear them, for a cultivated and developed sympathy is a particularly dangerous enemy of obtuseness, and obtuseness is necessary to carry out programs of enrichment that ignore inequality. Speaking of education in both India and Europe, Tagore said way back in the First World War period that aggressive nationalism needs to blunt the moral conscience. So it needs people who don't recognize the inner life of the individual, who speak group speak, who behave and see the world like docile bureaucrats. Art, he thought, was the great enemy of that obtuseness. And so his own school, which was largely based on the arts and humanities, was a radical experiment. It's deeply unpopular today, with politicians aiming at national success. So, educators for profit-making will very likely campaign against the humanities and arts as core ingredients of a basic education. This assault is currently taking place all over the world. What would the law schools of a nation focused on the growth paradigm look like? They would very likely be narrow and doctrinal, looking at law from the inside, rather than thinking critically about it from the vantage point of a broader set of social goals and aspirations. And they would focus above all on producing lawyers who could readily serve the interests of corporate elites, rather than advocates for all of a nation's citizens. Now, pure models of education for economic growth are difficult to find in flourishing democracies, since democracy is built on respect for each person, and the growth model respects only an aggregate. However, education systems all over the world are moving closer to the growth model without much thought about how ill-suited it is to the goals of democracy. How else might we think of the sort of nation and the sort of citizen we're trying to build? The primary alternative to the growth-based model on the international development scene, one with which I've long been associated, is known as the human development paradigm. According to this model, what's important is what opportunities or capabilities each person has in areas ranging from life, health, and bodily integrity to political liberty, political participation, and education. This model of development recognizes that each and every person possesses an inalienable human dignity that must be respected by laws and institutions. A decent nation, at a bare minimum, acknowledges that its citizens all have entitlements in these and other areas, and devises strategies to get people above a threshold of level of opportunity in each area. The human development model is committed to democracy, since having a voice in the choice of the policies that govern your life is a key ingredient of a life worthy of human dignity. The sort of democracy it favors will, however, be one with a strong role for fundamental human rights that cannot be taken away from people by majority whim. It will thus favor strong protections for political liberty, for the freedoms of speech, association, and religion, and fundamental entitlements in the so-called social and economic areas such as education and health. This model dovetails well with the aspirations pursued in the constitutions of India, South Africa, and other modern democracies. The US has never given constitutional protection, at least at the federal level, to entitlements in the social and economic areas, and yet Americans, too, have a sense that the ability of all citizens to attain these things is an important mark of national success. I fear, though, that that's ebbing away very rapidly at present. But at any rate, the human development model is not pie-in-the-sky idealism. It's closely related to the constitutional commitments, not always fulfilled, of many of the world's democratic societies. People who care about this approach will naturally give a great deal of emphasis to the quality of legal education and the values imparted in it. And they will seek a legal education that is both international and comparative, studying different ways of realizing these goals in different nations. But this gets ahead of my argument, so for the moment, let me just say something more about the general issue. So, if a nation wants to promote that type of humane, people-sensitive democracy, one dedicated to producing opportunities for what our Declaration of Independence calls life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for each and every person, what abilities will it need to produce in its citizens? At least the following seem crucial. First, the ability to deliberate well about political issues affecting the nation, to examine, reflect, argue, debate, deferring to neither tradition nor authority. Second, the ability to think about the good of the nation as a whole, not just that of one's own local group, and to see one's own nation in turn as part of a complicated world order in which issues of many kinds require intelligent transnational deliberation for their resolution. And third, the ability to have concern for the lives of others, to imagine what policies of many types mean for the opportunities and experiences of one's fellow citizens of many types and of people outside one's own nation. Well, now that we have that summary, let me go through each of these three abilities and think of them particularly in relationship to legal education. So first we have the capacity for Socratic self-criticism and critical thinking about one's own institutions and traditions. As Socrates argued, democracy needs citizens who can think for themselves rather than deferring to authority, who can reason together about their choices rather than just trading claims and counterclaims. Critical thinking is particularly important for good citizenship in a society that needs to come to grips with the presence of people who differ by ethnicity, caste, religion, gender, disability, and so on. We will only have a chance at an adequate dialogue across group boundaries if young citizens know how to engage in dialogue and deliberation in the first place. And they will only know how to do that if they learn how to examine themselves and think about the reasons why they're inclined to support one thing rather than another, rather than, as depressingly as so often happens, seeing political debate as simply a way of boasting or scoring points for their own side. When politicians bring simplistic propaganda their way, as politicians in all countries have a way of doing, young people will only have a hope of preserving independence and holding the politicians accountable if they know how to think critically about what they hear, testing its logic and imagining alternatives to it. Students exposed to instruction in critical thinking learn at the same time a new attitude to those who disagree with them. They learn to see people who disagree not as the opposing sports team to be defeated, but instead as people who have themselves reasons for what they think. When their arguments are reconstructed, it may even turn out that they share some important premises with one's own side, and will both understand better where the differences come from. Well, the idea that one will take responsibility for one's own reasoning and exchange ideas with others in an atmosphere of mutual respect for reason is one that needs to be encouraged from the very beginning of a child's education, and that has been emphasized by many progressive educators, including Tagore in India and John Dewey in the United States. But let's now consider the contribution that this ability makes at the higher level. Well, First of all, we need to report that even if we were just aiming at a successful business culture, leading corporate thinkers understand very well the importance of creating a corporate culture in which critical voices are not silenced, a culture of both individuality and accountability. In fact, both Singapore and China have recently conducted reforms to inject a great deal more in the way of active critical thinking into their systems of higher education, because they feel it's necessary to a healthy business atmosphere. Given their suspicion of true dissent, though, these experiments are on a very short leash, all criticism of the government being strongly discouraged, so the Socratic ideal is not very likely to be realized. But our goal, as I've said, is not simply healthy business culture, so let me now turn to political culture. As we'll see in more detail in the last part of my lecture, human beings are prone to be subservient to both authority and peer pressure. So we need to counteract those tendencies, producing a culture of individual dissent. One critical voice can have large consequences. How Wootten expresses admiration for the novel To Kill a Mockingbird for its portrait of the good citizen as the solitary dissenter. By emphasizing each person's active voice, we also promote a culture of accountability. When people see their ideas as their own responsibility, they're more likely to see their deeds as their own responsibility. But now to law school. It might seem that critical thinking is one thing that every law school cultivates. After all, don't they all practice a version of the Socratic method? However, I think this appearance is quite deceptive. In a curriculum burdened with the need to teach basic doctrinal content, as is very much the case in Australia, and perhaps more so than in the US, where state bar examinations perform much of that function, teaching active critical thinking is actually quite a challenge. Moreover, in a system increasingly oriented toward the business and corporate community, it's difficult to include critical thought about social inequality, about justice and inclusion. And yet, this sort of deep and wide-ranging critical thinking lies at the very heart of the whole enterprise of training lawyers. How Wootten once wrote, quote, "Decision-making on the basis of rational argument, integrity, and a passion for justice are not the monopoly of the legal profession, but they are central to its values," end quote. And he went on to emphasize that what we must produce in legal education is not just the clever reasoner, it's the person who can pursue justice even when advantage is on the other side, the person who really stands alone, like Socrates, who can tell truth to power. How can that deeper kind of critical thinking be taught? In every course, from criminal law to property to contracts, it can play a role if basic core subjects are taught, as Wootten again put it, not only from the inside, but also from the outside. That is to say, with historical perspective and a critical eye on the working of the power structure. But because not all faculty are equally interested in social criticism or equally good at it, it's also valuable to have some specialized courses whose focus is social justice. For example, at Chicago, our basic 1L class called Elements of Law, which has been recently brilliantly taught by Roz Dixon, your colleague this year, exposes entering students to a variety of critical and international perspectives, as it does also to basic concepts of jurisprudence. I myself routinely teach feminist philosophy and theories of social justice as 1L electives, and I find that students are extremely relieved and gratified to have these historical and critical perspectives after 2 quarters of basic doctrinal classes. The Socratic mission of law schools, however, won't be adequately realized without interdisciplinary cooperation and strong partnerships between law schools and humanities departments in the rest of the university. My own joint appointment in law and philosophy is an important aspect of what I'm able to contribute. So law schools can't afford to be isolationist. They must seek out excellent humanists and humanities departments in the university as a whole, both because these departments make direct contributions to their mission and because they participate in university-wide decision-making about funding and priorities. The second key ability of the modern democratic citizen, I would argue, is the ability to see oneself as a member of a heterogeneous nation and world, understanding something of the history and character of the different groups that inhabit it. Knowledge is no guarantee of good behavior, certainly, but ignorance is a virtual guarantee of bad behavior. Simple cultural and religious stereotypes abound in our world. For example, in the US, the facile equation of Islam with terrorism. And the first way to begin combating these is to make sure that from a very early age, young people learn a different relation to the world. They should gradually come to understand both differences that make understanding necessary between groups and nations, and the shared human needs and interests that make understanding essential if common problems are to be solved. This understanding of the world will promote human development only if it is itself infused by searching, critical thinking, thinking that focuses on differences of power and opportunity. History, for example, needs to be taught with an eye to thinking critically about those differences. At the same time, the traditions and religions of major groups in one's culture and the world can be taught with a view to promoting respect for one's fellow world citizens as equals and equally entitled to social and economic opportunity. In curricular terms, these ideas suggest that all young citizens, and again, at increasing levels of sophistication in the different levels of education, should learn rudiments of world history and should get a rich and non-stereotypical understanding of the major world religions, and then should learn how to inquire in more depth into at least one unfamiliar tradition, in this way acquiring tools that can be used elsewhere. At the same time, they must learn about the major traditions, majority and minority, within their own nation, focusing on understanding how differences of religion, race, and gender have been associated with differential life opportunities. When we think about recasting legal education in order to cultivate this ability, we don't have to think far, because curricula in many nations are currently being transformed so as to incorporate much more international and comparative law. And clinical programs in international human rights add to this curricular development. But I would argue that this is not quite enough. We need to incorporate an international and world history perspective in many, if not all, of the standard courses. It's one thing to study corporate law technically from the inside, learning the moves. It's a far richer thing also to study it historically and critically, thinking about how corporations emerged, how they acquired the great global power they now have, thinking about the role they currently play in the global economy. How Wootten complained that law, when he was a student, quote, was taught to me as an introverted discipline administered within its own parameters by an inward-looking profession, end quote. In today's complicated world, lawyers can hardly afford to be inward-looking in any subject. And this means that law faculty must draw on the resources of humanistic disciplines such as history, political philosophy, and religious studies. Once again, this means both hiring faculty with expertise in those areas and supporting and making alliances with those departments in the university as a whole. The third ability of the citizen, closely related to the first two, is what I would call the narrative imagination. This means the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to try to be an intelligent reader of that person's story and understand at least some of the emotions and wishes that someone so placed might have. The cultivation of sympathy has been a key part of the best modern ideas of progressive education in both non-Western and Western nations. Learning to see another human being not as an object to be manipulated, but as a full person, is not an automatic achievement. It must be promoted by an education that refines the ability to think about what the inner life of another may be like, and also to understand why one can never fully grasp that inner world, why any human being is always, to a certain extent, dark to any other. The humanities and arts can cultivate students' sympathy in many ways through engagement with many different works of literature, music, fine art, and dance. But thought needs to be given to what a student's particular blind spots are likely to be, and works can be chosen in consequence. For all societies at all times have their particular blind spots, groups within and also groups abroad that are particularly likely to be seen densely and obtusely, and perhaps with interest in manipulating them. Works of art can be chosen to promote criticism of this obtuseness and a more adequate vision of what generally has gone unseen. Ralph Ellison, the great African-American novelist, in a later essay about his great novel, Invisible Man, wrote that a novel like his could be, quote, a raft of perception, entertainment, and hope on which American culture could negotiate the snags and whirlpools that stand between it and the democratic ideal. Well, his novel, of course, as it announces in its opening paragraph, takes the so-called inner eyes of the white reader as its theme and its target. Its hero announces that he's invisible to white society, but he says, well, this invisibility is a problem of not of a chemical accident to my epidermis, but of a deficiency in their inner eyes. Well, so through the imagination, we're able to at least make some progress, having insight into the experience of another group or person that is often very difficult to attain in daily life, particularly when our world has constructed sharp separations between groups and suspicions that make encounters very difficult. Now, this ability and the courses that cultivate it might seem quite remote from technical legal education and difficult to include in a legal curriculum, unless in elective courses such as law and literature, which are fun for students but difficult to link to the main emphasis of their training. Clinical education does, of course, greatly stimulate the inner eyes, and thus Australian lawyers will ultimately get a valuable immersion in that sort of legal practice, but only after law school itself. And yet, it's quite important for law schools to produce lawyers who can occupy mentally the position of different groups in their society. There is no topic on which I find Hal Wooten's thoughts more stimulating. His own education, he reports, was utterly, quote, non-inclusive, end quote. Law was, quote, unconsciously taught as something catering for white middle-class males, the reasonable men in the Clapham omnibus, in the days before it was filled by Pakistanis and professional women on their way to work. Well, of course, the reader is expected to know that this hypothetical figure, the man on the Clapham omnibus, was used by Lord Devlin in order to argue in favor of the continued criminality of consensual relations between adults of the same sex. Devlin said that where that man on the omnibus feels strong disgust, we may forbid the practice that arouses the disgust through law. So the attitudes of that blinkered figure were allowed, Wootten is saying, to dominate the vision of the young lawyer. In the first handbook for this law school, by contrast, Wootten wrote, quote, a law school should have and communicate to its students a keen concern for those on whom the law may bear harshly, either because they cannot afford its services or because it does not sufficiently recognize their needs, or because they are in some way alienated from the rest of society, end quote. So Wootten then was calling from the very start of this law school for what Ellison called for, a cultivation of the inner eyes, so that the lives of the social unseen would be seen clearly and with understanding. How can legal education cultivate that keen concern, those inner eyes? To begin with, courses of all kinds can be taught with a keen eye to historical and social context and with the critical dimension of which I've already spoken, as students are encouraged to think about social justice and to see the legal system from the outside as well as the inside. The comparative and international dimension can also contribute to the work of seeing hierarchies in one's own society. But I think that humanities scholars, historians, political philosophers, literary scholars, have a key role to play in these developments because they are experts at enlivening the participatory imagination. Co-teaching is one very valuable way of taking advantage of the presence of such humanists in law schools. I co-teach a course called Decision Making to first-year law students with a colleague who's an expert in game theory and decision theory. They choose the course often to gain those fashionable techniques, But then they also are in for exposure to John Stuart Mill, Aristotle, Kant, and a variety of literary authors who make the issue of perspective-taking come alive for them. We also do offer a wide range of law and literature courses, and we regularly hold conferences on law and literature topics, which bring distinguished figures to campus to think about the imagination. One of our conferences on Shakespeare and the law involved Justice Stephen Breyer talking with English professors, philosophers, and other judges about how the fictional world of Shakespeare's plays enriches the thinking of a lawyer or judge. This year, we're building up for a conference on manhood in American law and literature with the well-known author Joyce Carol Oates as our plenary speaker that will investigate ways in which social stereotypes of masculinity affect and often deform legal thought at many levels. So, the cultivation of imagination can take place at many levels of the legal curriculum, infusing basic courses, creating elective courses, and generating extracurricular activities that are fun and lure students in. There's a general observation I want to make at this point, although perhaps it's clear from what I've already said. The humanities, as I conceive them, are not elitist. They are part of the mental equipment of every good citizen, and especially of every lawyer who is going to be good at serving citizens. In Australia, I often encounter the idea that humanities are for privileged elites, not part of general education for all. No doubt they have been viewed this way and practiced that way, and in Britain, they long were taught that way. John Stuart Mill already complained in 1867 in his rector's address at St. Andrews University in Scotland that English universities teach the classics as a set of frills for gentlemen rather than thinking about what every single person should know as a preparation for citizenship and life, the approach that he found in Scotland to a greater degree. But he did not conclude that the humanities should no longer be taught. He concluded they should be taught differently, with an eye not to pluming oneself on one's knowledge of the great books, but with an eye to what one can do in life, how one can interact with others in a political community, how one can serve that community. The vision I've been defending here is essentially Mill's vision, and it means not taking a list of great books for granted, a practice that I've long attacked in the US, but instead asking what curriculum could bring a heterogeneous group of young citizens into a productive dialogue and a rigorous dialogue around the needs of the community, something to which, as I've argued here, the humanities do make an invaluable contribution. The US used to teach the humanities in the English way as a set of plumes in the hats of privileged young men, and I do mean men, but World War II produced a radical shift, a democratization of higher education, as all returning GIs were given rights to university education by the GI Bill. Educators understood they had to think afresh about the entire topic of the free society and what produced it. One of the most eloquent statements coming out of this period was a book I still love called General Education in a Free Society, written at Harvard by the literary critic I.A. Richards and other humanities faculty. They ask, how shall we educate people together if they vary greatly in class, region, and prior preparation? And they come up with curricular proposals that still have merit today. They allocated fully 1/3 of the undergraduate curriculum to the humanities. As time went on, however, it was not enough to think about differences of class. In the 1970s and after, people realized that an understanding of race and of the situation of women had to be incorporated into the curriculum. And more recently, the study of the variety of human sexuality has become a feature of humanities curricula around the country. Each of these developments has its analog in legal education. So in fact, the humanities, far from being in their very nature elitist, provide crucial tools for understanding a nation's minorities and cultivating the critical capacities and the imaginative resources to move people beyond the hierarchies they often unthinkingly inhabit. But you may still be asking, why really do these things matter so much? Why is a humanistic agenda for education in general and legal education in particular so important? At this point, I think we need to just pause and think about some of the problems we face on the way to making people responsible democratic citizens who might possibly implement a human development agenda. So what is it about human beings that makes it so hard to sustain egalitarian democratic institutions and so easy to lapse into hierarchies of various types, or even worse, projects of violent group animosity as a powerful group attempts to establish its supremacy? Whatever these forces are in human life, it's ultimately against them that true education for human development must fight. So it must, as I would put it, following Gandhi, engage with the clash of civilizations inside each person, as respect for others contends against narcissistic aggression. We legal educators need to try to understand these psychological factors, both because lawyers are human and prone to the same deformations of desire and thought as other people, and because they have a special degree of responsibility and agency. As servants of a nation's citizens and upholders of justice and the rule of law, they must actively inhibit baneful tendencies and foster good ones. This internal clash can be found in all modern societies in different forms, since all contain struggles over inclusion and equality, whether the precise locus of these struggles is in debates about immigration or the accommodation of religious, racial, and ethnic minorities, or gender equality or affirmative action. So what then do we know by now about forces in the personality that militate against democratic reciprocity and respect? First, we know that people have a very high level of deference to authority. Psychologist Stanley Milgram, in famous experiments, showed that experimental subjects were willing to administer what they believed to be a very painful and dangerous level of electric shock to the other person who was working really for the experimenter, so long as the superintending scientist told them that they should go ahead. What they were doing was all right, even when the other person was screaming in pain, which of course was faked for the sake of the experiment. Solomon Asch, a little bit earlier, showed that experimental subjects have an amazingly high level of deference to peer pressure. They were willing to go against the clear evidence of their senses when all the other people around them are making sensory judgments that are off target, even about such simple things as which line is longer than another line. If at least 6 people working for the experimenter said the wrong thing, the person actually being tested would go along and say something that was against the clear evidence of their senses. Both Milgram's work and Asch's have been used effectively by Christopher Browning, historian, to illuminate the behavior of young Germans in a police battalion that murdered Jews during the Nazi era. So great was the influence of both peer pressure and authority on these young men that the ones who couldn't bring themselves to shoot the Jews felt ashamed of their weakness. Related research demonstrates that apparently normal people can very easily be led to humiliate and stigmatize others in a context in which both peer pressure and authority operate. One particularly chilling example involves school children whose teacher informs them that children with blue eyes are superior and children with brown eyes are inferior. Hierarchical and cruel behavior quickly ensues. The teacher then comes in the next day and informs the children that she's made a terrible mistake. It's the children with brown eyes who are superior, the children with blue eyes who are inferior. And the bad behavior just flips around, so the children learn nothing from the pain of exclusion, and they just start getting revenge on the other group. Perhaps the most famous experiment of this type is Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, in which he found that subjects randomly cast in the role of prison guard and prisoner begin to behave differently right away. The prison guards use their authority to humiliate and denigrate, and the prisoners become passive, inert, and depressed. Other research on disgust, on which I've drawn in writing about the role of disgust in discrimination against gays and lesbians, shows that people are very uncomfortable with the signs of their own animality and mortality. Disgust in general is an emotion that polices the boundary between ourselves and other animals and expresses anxiety about our animal bodies. In virtually all societies, it's not enough to keep ourselves free from putative contamination by bodily waste products that are, in the language of psychologists, animal reminders. Instead, people create again and again subordinate groups of human beings whom they identify as disgusting and contaminating, saying that they're dirty, smelly, bearers of disease and germs, and so on. There's a lot of work done on how such attitudes figure in anti-Semitism, in the Indian caste system, in American racism against African Americans, in sexism, and most recently in discrimination against gays and lesbians. What else do we know? We know that these forces take on much more power when people are anonymous or not held personally accountable. People act much worse under the shelter of anonymity as part of a faceless mass than they do when they're watched and made accountable as individuals. Second, people behave badly when no one raises a critical voice. Ash's subjects went along with the erroneous judgment when all the other people whom they took to be fellow experimental subjects concurred in the error. But if even one person, before it got to them, said the right thing, they were simply free to follow their own sensory judgment. Third, people behave badly when the human beings over whom they have power are portrayed in a way that dehumanizes them, as numbers rather than names, or let's say like an animal. And so, in thinking how we might help individuals and societies combat these tendencies, we do well to think about how we can turn these things on their head. Lawyers are agents of social accountability. So it's particularly important that they have an education that teaches them effective ways of raising a critical voice and getting others to do so, and that cultivates their ability to see the lives of citizens of many different kinds, not as mere numbers or as just blocks or things, but rather with understanding, respect, and sympathy. The other side of the internal clash is each person's capacity for compassionate concern, for seeing another person as an end and not a mere means. We now know from the wonderful research of Paul Bloom at Yale that children as young as 1 year old are capable of occupying the perspective of another person. Usually, however, this ability is exercised in a very narrow sphere, namely the child's parents and their immediate circle. And at first, it's used manipulatively for the child to get whatever it wants. One of the easiest ways to regain lost omnipotence is to make slaves of other people. And young children initially do conceive of the other human beings in their lives as mere tools of their own satisfaction. But as time goes on, if things go well, they grow to feel gratitude and love toward the separate beings who support their needs, and therefore guilt about their own excessive demands and real concern for the well-being of the other person. As concern develops, it leads to an increasing wish to control one's own narcissistic aggression. Such recognitions are typically unstable, since human life is a chancy business and we all feel anxieties that lead us to want more control, including control over other people. But a good development in the family, and then, later on, an education that broadens this capacity for concern and sympathy beyond the narrow circle and extends it to other groups and societies, can actually lead people to see each human being, even perhaps in the whole world, as someone who has human dignity and rights that are equal to its own. This cultivation of the inner eyes has to continue through law school because lawyers are such crucial gatekeepers of all a society's entitlements. If they don't have the right sort of concern and vision, everyone suffers. Well, let's conclude and take stock. How are the abilities of citizenship doing in the world today? Pretty poorly, I fear. Education of the type I've been recommending is doing reasonably well in the place where I first began to study it, namely the liberal arts portion of U.S. college and university curricula. And in fact, it's a part of the curriculum that particularly attracts philanthropic support, as rich people remember with pleasure the time when they read books that they loved with no instrumental aim in view, and so on. But now there's great strain. President Drew Faust of Harvard reports that even there, the economic downturn has reinforced a picture that the value of a university degree is largely instrumental, and university leaders are increasingly pressured by their own boards to embrace a market model of their mission, in consequence cutting back the liberal arts. Outside the US, many nations whose university curricula don't include a liberal arts component are now striving to build one. And I heard that this is happening in Australia, and I want to know more about those experiments. And I have been involved in such discussions in places ranging from Scotland, where there's an old tradition of this sort, to the Netherlands, Sweden, India, Germany, and others. But I think it's too soon to know whether reform in this direction will really take place, because teaching of the liberal arts sort has a certain kind of pedagogy that goes with it. It needs small sections or small classes, and it needs faculty who are heavily invested in bringing alive the critical thinking of each student. And it's not obvious to me that European educators are really willing to take that on. And I shudder when I hear about an ethics course in Norway that's in a lecture hall with 500 people, and then there's a multiple choice exam and so on. So it has to be done with the right pedagogy, or it might as well not be done at all. So the universities of the world have great merits, but also great and increasing problems. By contrast, and I think this is going to feed up and affect everything, the abilities of citizenship are doing very poorly in every nation in the crucial years of child development, the years of K through 12. Here, the demands of the global market have made everyone focus on scientific and technical proficiency as the key abilities, and the humanities and the arts are increasingly perceived as useless frills. To the extent that they're the focus of any national discussion, they're recast as technical, testable abilities themselves, and are tested by quantitative multiple choice examinations, as in the No Child Left Behind Act in the United States. As for legal education, the future is not yet clear. Certainly, the increasing focus on international and comparative law in law schools around the world is a very healthy sign, and the increasing interdisciplinarity of many law schools is also promising, with appointments of PhDs from history, philosophy, and other humanities fields, as well as the longer-term presence of economists. But on the other hand, one all too often sees an increasing domination of the curriculum by the demands of the corporate world, and this is particularly so in this era of economic anxiety. In India, for example, legal education is almost exclusively pre-corporate, and public law is barely even taught. And everywhere, the humanities, history, philosophy, literature are always an embattled set of minority perspectives. What will we have if these trends continue? Nations, as Tagore said, of technically trained people who don't know how to criticize authority, useful profit makers with obtuse imaginations. Tagore observed, studying the educational institutions of his own time, that this sort of educational failure amounted to what he called a suicide of the soul. Well, that might be a little extreme. I hope it is. But what could be more frightening than even a small tendency in that direction? So how can we avoid going down that road? Democracies have great rational and imaginative powers. They're also prone to the common human flaws that we see in human beings, to deference to authority and peer pressure, and then just mere haste, sloppiness, and everyday selfishness. Education based mainly on profitability in the global market magnifies these deficiencies, producing a greedy obtuseness and a technically trained docility that threaten the very life of democracy itself, and that certainly impede the creation of a decent world culture. If the real clash of civilizations is, as I think, a clash inside each individual person, as greed contends against respect for human dignity, all modern societies are rapidly losing this battle, as they're feeding the forces that lead to dehumanization and failing to feed the forces that lead to cultures of equality and respect. If we don't insist loudly on the importance of the humanities and arts, they will wither away because they don't make money, so they don't make a profit in any very obvious sense. They only do what is more precious than that: make a world that is worth living in, people who are able to see other human beings as full people with thoughts and feelings of their own that deserve respect and sympathy, and nations that are able to overcome fear and suspicion in favor of sympathetic and reasoned debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Nussbaum. And to deliver the vote of thanks, I call on Emeritus Professor Hal Wootten. Hal.
Well, here we are again. This is becoming something of a habit. This is the sixth occasion I have had the privilege of expressing my appreciation of the establishment of this eponymous lecture, and my delight that it is not the Hal Wootten Memorial Lecture. It is the fifth occasion I've had the pleasure of thanking an eminent person for the honour they have done me by delivering the lecture bearing my name. On the other occasion, I was the speaker. Despite my attempts at humour, there has been no question of the lecture becoming a memorial lecture. As the program tells you, it was established not to commemorate me, but to what is generously described as my founding vision of the law school. Looking back, it is easy to see that it was never a static founding vision, and it was never just my vision. It has always been our vision of the law school, a living vision which now for over 40 years has been contributed to, shared, developed, adapted to changing circumstances, and above all, lived by an ever-growing number of staff, students, graduates, and supporters. Today it takes new life from the contribution of Martha Nussbaum, who, combining the erudition of the past and the passion of the present, has situated our vision in a great and continuous humanistic tradition, one that stretches back in time to the Greeks and even earlier eras, in space to most parts of the world, embracing people of many different cultures and many different religions and of none, surfacing wherever men and women have reflected on what it means to be human. Listening to her, I felt a little like the man who was surprised to learn that he had been speaking prose all his life without realising it. I doubt that it occurred to any of us 40 years ago that we were marching to the drumbeat of a great tradition. Our aspirations were more modest and practical. We just thought we could build a better law school, one in which students could have a rich and rewarding experience in those precious years in which they prepared to step out into the world. One in which staff could be not lonely scholars, but members of a vibrant community of thinking, learning, researching and teaching. One from which could emerge the kind of lawyers needed by a society that valued freedom, justice, equality and diversity. Law was not a business but a profession. We saw a law school, however, not as the creature of a profession, but as an independent yet integral part of a profession in a classical sense. That is, a group which enjoys privileges in the provision of certain services needed by society, and in return takes responsibility for the provision of those services to the whole community, for the confidence and integrity of its members, and for the advancement of knowledge in its discipline. Like the humanities and arts themselves, law has two enemies from within: those who would make it a market and those who would make it a priesthood. The former, who would subject the law, the humanities, and everything else to the market test of gain, with all other social goods seen as byproducts of wealth, have been Martha Nussbaum's target tonight. On other occasions, she has done battle with the priestly caste. Few people in recent times have done so much to give the humanities a bad name as Alan Bloom, who in the closing of The American Mind surprisingly claimed that opening minds to new perspectives like feminism had in fact closed them. As Martha Nussbaum demonstrated in a devastating review of the book at the time, Bloom's real desire was to reclose the American mind by adopting a view of the humanities as a collection of sacred texts with hidden truths to be interpreted by a privileged elite. A similar view of law was powerful when I was a student and played a role in the antipathy to Julius Stone, who taught a generation of students to see law not as a collection of sacred texts whose exegesis was a task for a priestly professional class, but as a man-made set of rules to be evaluated like other social facts in terms of practical reasoning, social consequences, and justice. And even when the school was founded 40 years ago, there was near panic in some quarters that it might be a sanctuary not for priests, but for heretics who would engage in critical thinking and advocate social justice. How right they were. While the arts and humanities are classic resources for humanistic values, it is those values that matter. Martha follows the battle for them wherever it leads, tonight to the teaching of law. Perhaps there is even greater need to take it to other disciplines, to economics where the justification for the primacy of profit is theorised, to business and commerce where the pursuit of wealth becomes an art form, and to technologies ever ready to be their unquestioning servants. Tonight, Martha has given us a comprehensive, stimulating analysis of the challenges and the possibilities of law in the modern world. We thank her for that. We thank her for having also shown us the place of our vision in the great humanistic tradition and having inspired us to carry forward our modest contribution in the challenging times that lay around us and before us. Thank you.